Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson, and we've got a treat for you this week. It is our second ever returning guest. The great Stephen Graham Jones is back on the show. We're going to talk about his new book, The Buffalo Hunter, which is out March 18th, wherever fine books are available. We're also going to talk about one of the best vampire movies ever made, Near Dark, directed by Kathryn Bigelow. One of my favorite vampire movies, one of Steven's favorites, and since The Buffalo Hunter is his vampire novel, we talked a lot about vampires. It's a really fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. But first, I wanted to remind you one more time that Ghoulish Book Festival is upon us this Friday and Saturday. If you're listening to this when it comes out, that's March 14th and 15th in San Antonio, Texas. You can still go get tickets. Or badges, I guess they call them badges. You can still get badges for Ghoulish Book Fest. Go to ghoulish.rip for all the details there. I will definitely be there on Saturday. I will be on the Ghoul Master panel, which is the Ghoulish Book Fest version of Taskmaster, if you know about Taskmasters. So I'm probably going to make a fool of myself in a way that is hopefully entertaining. I'm also on a panel about creating art in the middle of an apocalypse, which is, I don't know why they picked that topic. Doesn't seem relevant. Anyway, doing those panels, I will be hanging out, watching the other panels, buying way too many books from the vendor's room. I will also have Scares That Shaped Us stickers available in limited quantities. My wife was very kind enough to make me some stickers with QR codes linking to all our stuff. So if you see me, say hi. If you like the show, I got a free sticker for you. Hope to see people out there. In terms of recommendations this week, I will just say that as I'm recording this, March 11th, Cynthia Pelayo's Vanishing Daughters has just been released. I wrote a review of that over at Paste Magazine. You can go check that review out. Spoiler alert, the book's amazing. You should absolutely pick it up, whether you know Cynthia's work already or you're a newcomer, a relative newcomer to her work as I have been over the last few months. Vanishing Daughters, great stuff. Go pick it up. Oh, and I should note before we head into the interview, this was my first time recording an episode of the show in person with the other person sitting across from me. Steven visited Austin a few weeks ago and was kind enough to carve out time in his schedule for me. And we sat in his hotel room in Austin and talked about vampires and Near Dark and the Buffalo Hunter and some other stuff. So if the audio quality is a little bit weird and not what you're used to, I apologize. We worked with what we had that day. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Let's get right over to our interview with Stephen Graham Jones. Joining us this week for The Scares That Shaped Us, live and in person from a hotel room in Austin, Texas, is friend of the show, Bram Stoker award-winning author of the Indian Lake trilogy, I Was a Teenage Slasher, and now coming to you on March 18th, The Buffalo Hunter. Stephen Graham Jones, welcome back.
Man, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for doing this, in the middle of a trip. I know you've got, readings and you're meeting with important people at the University of Texas, so I appreciate you.
Oh, man, I'm happy to talk to you. I like to be on here. I want to talk about Near Dark. I'm happy to do that. Man.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun to talk about maybe the greatest American vampire movie ever made. Yeah. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Buffalo Hunter, which is coming out soon. It is fantastic. It's also, I think, unlike any other Stephen Graham Jones book ever. If you wouldn't mind giving listeners a taste what the Buffalo Hunter is.
Yeah, the Buffalo Hunter is in 2012, an old diary turns up in Miles City, Montana, that finds its way to Etsy Bocarn, a professor at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. Turns out her great-great-great-grandfather kept this diary and recorded what happened to him in 1912, which was, in 1912, a Blackfeet dude came to his service, stayed after the service, and started telling his life story in a series of installments over successive Sundays. His life story is maybe he's a vampire. Maybe he came after the losers who were out shooting more buffalo than they could eat. And it gets bloody, a lot of teeth in this novel, a lot of dead people. A lot of dead things, actually.
Well, this was built on a real historical massacre of the Blackfeet people that happened in 1870. Is that right?
January 23rd, 1870.
Yeah. So, in similar to, again, this isn't like anything else you've ever written, I don't think, but similar to Don't Fear the Reaper, you have these historical roots of atrocity that are now spilling over into 1912 and then into 2012. Did it start for you with that chunk of history that I know is personal for you, or did it just start with, I want to do a vampire book finally?
You know, I've written about that massacre. Let's see. It's come up in my books 2 times, and it's come up in a book I have not published yet a 3rd time. I think I'm going to erase it from that book, though, because I've already done it here. But, yeah, I think you're right. This book actually comes from me wanting to finally do a vampire novel. Like, the rule I gave myself for finally someday doing a vampire novel was that I could only do it if I could do it in a way that hasn't been done and do it in a way I could believe in. Which isn't to say everyone else's vampires are fake. It's just I have like different, thresholds for investing in a character and a monster and a creature, and they have to make biological sense to me. I mean, somewhat. I mean, the kernel of werewolves or vampires or zombies, it's finally insensible. It doesn't make sense, Yeah. But if you can accept that one little thing, like yes, werewolves, yes, zombies, yes, vampires, everything after that needs to make sense to me in a really rigorous way. And so I'd written a whole lot of vampire stories and finally got around to doing it in novel form, and it was really fun. It was eye-opening, liberating, just a blast.
This was something that I think when we were talking about Teenage Slasher last year, you had mentioned that you weren't going to write a vampire book until you could make vampires make sense for you. And I don't want to give too much away about how your vampires behave and anything that spoils the book, but did you find any particular one key way in for that?
I came at it the same way that Robert McCammon comes at werewolves in The Wolf's Hour in, what was that, 89, I guess? And I remember when his werewolves when his humans would transform into werewolves, they would have to adhere to like conservation of mass. If the human weighed 167 pounds, then the wolf would weigh 167 pounds. And I really appreciated that kind of just, fidelity to what I consider reality. And so with vampires, I tried to do some approximation of that. And if I did have a model, the same way that Near Dark could be said to be my model for mongrels, I think the vampires in Near Dark could somewhat be my model for the Buffalo Hunter.
So I want to ask a very specific plot question, and if you consider this a spoiler, tell me, and I won't. I'll cut it out of the show. I found it so interesting that you had this idea that when a vampire feeds on a particular organism, it starts to take on certain traits of that organism. It reminded me of Animal Man a little bit. Is that something we can talk about?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where did that arrive for you? How did that come about? I love that idea.
Thank you. I think all monsters need controls. Otherwise, they just rampage and they have too much power. You've got to figure out ways to put governors on your vampires. And so that was one of 2 main governors I put on my vampires was they couldn't feed indiscriminately. They had to feed on what hurts them the most, basically. And I mean, to me, it's not like being a vampire is a curse. It's not a privilege. It's not like being a superhero. So I want it to hurt. And for it to hurt, then it has to hurt what they have to feed on. And not like Louis in Interview with the Vampire, who is just guilty generally. I don't want to kill anything. He probably didn't even want to kill the rats he drinks, I wasn't interested in that so much as I was interested in finding a way to just put a cap on the vampire's abilities. And that, to me, that's really important. That's how I can start to believe in a creature, if it makes sense in that way.
You've talked about that before, like navigating slasher conventions, and like it's you talk about it like the 2 foot box or the 3 foot box. I forget how many feet, but you said if you tell me to dance in a box, it makes more sense to me. You also have this, you brought up Interview with the Vampire, you have this nested narrative happening. And 3, not only a nested narrative, but 3 very distinct voices. You have Etsy in 2012, and then Arthur, her ancestor, in 1912, and then you have Goodstab, who is, I think, one of the most fascinating characters you've ever come up with. Was it always a nested story in your mind? Because I could see a version of this that's literally like a teenage slasher thing where it's just Goodstab telling the story.
Yeah, I did consider that, but to me, there was always one level of nesting. If I had an image when I started this story, and I did have an image actually, and I thought it was going to be a short story. It was an old timey preacher delivers his sermon. The congregation files out, and after they file out, there's one dude sitting in the back, and I always knew that was a vampire waiting to talk to this priest. And so, in order to relay that story, I imagined it was going to be the priest recounting, this tale of what happened. But Etsy was a complete surprise. I didn't know there was going to be that second wrapper around Goodstab's story, and I wish I could. I don't know where that came from. I felt like I needed an on-ramp to get to 1912 is what it was, I suspect. But then her story kind of ambushed me. I didn't know her story was going to matter the way it does. And that was really, to me, this novel doesn't work if it's just Arthur telling the story of what happened to him in 1912 and somebody's reading it in 1913 or whatever. It kind of fails. But as for this nesting, I don't know, instinct, compulsion, tendency, I think it just comes from how much I've read Philip K. Dick, and he often does. It's either I don't know if you call his narratives nested necessarily. It's more like they branch out like mycelial networks or something, and you don't really know what's reality. You don't have a floor to stand on anymore, and that's kind of what nested narratives do for you. But I guess maybe this is really built more like a Conrad story, a Joseph Conrad thing. His stories are always nested. Somebody telling somebody else's story of what happened 10 years ago. And it just goes one step further. I'm not saying it's better than Conrad, but it goes one nesting step further.
Well, this is interesting that it just occurred to me, another story that tells a vampire narrative in fragments and bits of perspective. Like, obviously, it goes back to Dracula. Like Stoker did this. And you have Stoker doing it, you have Anne Rice doing it. It feels like something that's very, very compatible with vampire stories, and I suspect the nature of a vampire's lifespan has something to do with that. But given what you and I have talked about previously about the idea of like found footage fiction and first person narratives, why do you think that this kind of storytelling lends itself to vampires so well?
Yeah, I think number one, you're right. I think vampires have such long lives that telling their stories in retrospect from a far after point is compelling. It allows some context, some hindsight kind of things to go on, and thus some interpretation. But also, I think telling the story from a remove or two away allows the story to operate such that if we choose to, we can read the vampire as almost metaphor. It's not quite real, And those stories are always so compelling to me. I love to get to the end of the story and ask myself, did that really happen? That's so fun for me. I know that there's a prejudice against it was all a dream stories in the world, and for good reason. I think when we have a moment at the end where a character wakes up and like, oh, that was fun, I'm going to go get some lemonade now, that can feel like a cheat because it erases everything that came before. But there are, it was all a dream stories that escalate, that amplify the meaning, and that's what I'm always interested in.
The image that you talked about of a man sitting at the back of a church after the service is over is such a classic Western image. I could see it happening in any movie that John Ford ever made, any movie that Howard Hawks ever made, any book that Cormac McCarthy wrote in that era. And I know that you have a history with the Western genre too. What are some of the Western touchstones or revisionist Western touchstones or whatever you want to call it that maybe helped shape this book, particularly when you go back to Goodstab's story?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, for me, this story, Buffalo Hunter doesn't happen without James Welch doing Fool's Crow and also Winter in the Blood, and I guess The Death of Jim Loney. Really all of his books, Heart Song of Charging Elk, Indian Lawyer. But, I probably side more with Quentin Tarantino, and that Sergio Leone gave us everything we needed with the Western. The spaghetti Western shot in Spain, Italian movies, shot in Spain and everything. And not they weren't really engaging with the West. They were engaging with the world's conception of the West, and that to me is so compelling and fascinating. So yes, Goodstab sitting in the back of that church after the sermon is over. He's basically Charles Bronson cocked up on a bar playing a harmonica.
I was gonna ask what your favorite Leone is. Is it Once Upon a Time in the West?
No, it's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I always go back to for whatever reason. I think it's just because I love Lee Van Cleef in it, but I love For a Few Dollars More.
Oh yeah.
It's the one that no one ever talks about because it's bookended by such good stuff. But it's great too.
Oh, it is, man.
So I want to ask you, have another thing coming out. I mean, you always have stuff coming out, but this summer, Saga is releasing a they're calling it a Saga double that is 2 novellas.
No, they're novels.
Oh, they're okay. So wait, the first. Oh, you're right, because the one is The Babysitter Lives, which was out with an audio original that is now going to be in print for the first time. The other is called Killer on the Road, which is new, correct? So what can you tell us about Killer on the Road?
Killer on the Road is a highway horror novel, kind of, to me, built around Joyride or The Forsaken. I love road movies. Road movies are so compelling to me. Number one, because I get to talk about cars and trucks, and I love that. But I just like highways. I've been on so many highways in my life, and I have periods in my life that I consider highway years, And so Killer on the Road is this character runs away from home her senior year of high school, pretty much, and encounters someone out there who is after her and her friends. And this person, I'm not sure, human is probably the wrong thing to call them. They are some sort of monster, and they're very, what's the word? Not witty, but they like to have conversations. They like to engage. They like to play with their food before they eat it. That's probably the way to say it.
I'm excited about it. If you haven't read The Babysitter Lives, everybody, it's on audio. That was Isabella Star LeBlanc narrated that. It's a fantastic, weird riff on. I don't even know how to describe what you do in that book, so I'm not going to try. But those are coming out this summer in one volume from Saga, which is amazing. I also want to ask something a little esoteric because someone pointed it out on Blue Sky the other day, which is a quirk of your prose, your use of the word to, which often comes at the beginning of a sentence or the second word in a sentence.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting use of the word. Is that something that you're conscious of, or just something that again, this is super esoteric for people who don't have a book in front of them, but where does that come from?
It may come from years and years ago. Somebody said somewhere, I don't know if it was live or online or where it was, they said, I always know it's your writing, Stephen, because you always put yeah in there, like comma, yeah, comma, and I do. And so I suspect that 2 has developed as me trying to not be the yeah guy,
Mine is so. Yeah. All my nonfiction and fiction, the word so shows up so often. You also have a thing that I was reading Buffalo Hunter last night, and someone said this where you say someone nodded about it.
Yeah.
He nodded about that, which I always find it is such a singular. And I don't want to ask how style forms, because I know style forms from just writing and writing and writing. But do you ever find yourself looking at stuff like that in your prose and going, I should refine this, I should fix this, I should...
Early on, I butted heads with a whole lot of copy editors who wanted to normal my fiction down and take away those noddings and the pointing with the lips and all that stuff. But to me, it's not like I try to preserve it, but neither can I help it from happening. So what I've got to do is just not delete it. And when I read writers who come from rural areas, who live out in the pastures and work on horses and off tractors and stuff, they have that similar tendency I have, where there's a lot of nodding, a lot of eyes, a lot of motions with the lips and the chins and everything. And I think that comes from working in loud places around heavy equipment and the the shuffling hooves of cattle and stuff. You learn to communicate nonverbally, and I think nonverbal is a good 2/3, if not like 70% of how we communicate. And I do try to capture that on the page. I don't like go to great lengths to it. It's just natural. It's the way I grew up. I grew up working off tractors and off horses, and I grew up with people who communicated like that. You wouldn't necessarily say the words, you would signal it with your face, with your body. And the reason I think the face gets mentioned a lot is because your hands are doing stuff. You're holding on to something that you can't let go. So you got to make your point known with just your nods, with your lips, with your eyes, with your chin, and everything. And I always wonder if people who grew up in the city have a different way of communicating that I'll never know, because it's so alien to me. And I bet I am missing a lot of communication when I come to town.
Well, it adds movement to scenes too, which I think is so important. The sense, because you can just do a big block of dialogue, but if you say that someone cocked their chin toward their shoulder or something like that, it adds a nice like resonance. But you talked about working around horses, working out in fields and things like that. And I think that's a good on ramp to the topic at hand, because we're going to talk about one of the best. Rural. I'm pulling up the details about this movie on my phone so that we have it in front of us. One of the best like rural horror movies ever. One of the best vampire movies ever. Kathryn Bigelow's Near Dark, released in 1987. Written by Eric Red, or co-written by Eric Red. Honestly, this dances back and forth with Bram Stoker's Dracula as my favorite vampire movie ever. It is so wonderful. It's like weirdly out of print and hard to find now, but if you can scrounge up a copy, absolutely watch it. What do you remember about your first time experiencing Near Dark?
If you can scrounge up a copy. I've got it on Blu-ray, but also I've got an old VHS of it even, and I wanted to watch it like that for this podcast, but I also wanted to watch it on a huge screen, and that's not going to work very well with VHS. What I remember about my first time is nothing. It's terrible. I hear all these people on your podcast, they can like totally sketch out a scene of what it was like the first time they saw this or read that. And I have so few movies I can do that with. Like, I remember the first time I saw Scream. I remember the first time I saw Paranormal Activity, The Ring. Saw 3 was here in Austin, actually. And the reason I remember Saw 3, it was a good movie, a good film, but I remember it because it was a completely packed house on opening day, and when the credits rolled up, everyone in the audience stood up and clapped, and I was like, and that was my first time to experience something like that in a movie theater. That's why I remember Scream 3, but I do not remember the first time I saw Near Dark. It was not in the theater, I know that, because it came out in 87, and I would have been 15, and by the time I was 15, I think I had been to exactly one movie in the theater, and because that was not something we did. We didn't go to the movies, and I didn't have my own truck, so I couldn't go to town to see movies I wanted. I'd seen some stuff on VHS, but I didn't go to the theater, so I would have probably caught it, I would guess, somewhere between 89 and 92. And but I do know the feeling. I know what it gave me. It gave me the exact same thing that Larry McMurtry's The Last Picture Show gave me, which was a sudden like dawning awareness that, you mean you can tell stories out in an empty pasture of mesquite, and that story can have impact? Because that's where I grew up. I grew up in West Texas, out in the mesquite, doing, where nothing was. It was not interesting at all to anyone, probably not even to us who were growing up there. But I always thought to tell good stories, you had to go to the city. You had to go to exciting places. But Near Dark and The Last Picture Show told me that you can have stories right here where you live, and that was hugely, hugely important to me.
It is such a... it takes place mostly in Oklahoma, but we're not going to hold that against it too much. Yeah. It's such a classic... Speaking of Westerns, like it is a Western narrative. Essentially, it's about a farm boy named Caleb who meets a girl on like a Friday night in town, such as it is, meets her. She has an ice cream cone, a soft serve ice cream cone, which those of us who grew up in towns where Dairy Queen was kind of the only thing around, or if you had a Tasty Freeze.
Yeah.
That makes sense to us. And he meets her and decides he likes her, and she slowly reveals to him that she's a vampire and is a member of a band of nomadic vampires who are trying to initiate him. It's sort of the Western version of The Lost Boys, which is interesting because they came out around the same time. And it's such a, you can read it as a coming of age story about like a rebellious kid who like joins up with a gang of outlaws, because that's basically what it is. But it has this feral quality to it that we talked about road movies. It's a road movie. It made me think of Mongrels rewatching it, because it has that like seat of your pants quality to it. What do you remember about how they worked that stuck with you in this movie? Because they are very interesting vampires.
Yeah, I mean, probably the biggest thing I remember is that cross on the handle of Jesse's pistol. And, before this, crosses always burn vampires and make them retreat into a corner and hiss. But he brazenly has a cross right there on the grip of his pistol. And that, to me, is just a huge signal that these are not the vampires that you've known. They don't wear black capes with red silk interiors and keep the collar popped. They don't go to cocktail parties. They're just struggling to get by every single day, and they don't have fangs either. They got flat teeth. They got to use spurs and stuff to cut people's throats. And to tell you the truth, the vampires felt like a lot of people I knew who were living hand to mouth like that, just day to day, trying to eke out an existence. And the people I knew weren't vampires, but they may as well have been,
It's a really... we know the movie follows Caleb and May. It's very much a vampire Western romance coming-of-age story, but it is best remembered because of Lance Henriksen, Jeanette Goldstein, and Bill Paxton, who are the three of the four other vampires in this group. And Bill Paxton in particular, as Severin, is the rowdiest dude you've ever met at a bar, but a murderous vampire with these ultra sharp spurs. And he's become the avatar for the movie, because you mentioned the way that they have to feed, which of course makes for some amazing moments. But the way that they are wounded and the way that they interact with the sun is also very interesting. It has this I think of it in terms of my personal history with vampire movies as they take away all the holy water crosses, garlic, forget about that. But then even with the sunlight, it's a malleable thing. They can go out in the sun if they cover themselves up. They can exist for a while in the sun and they'll get horribly burned, but they'll eventually be okay. It's just it plays with the rules in so many interesting ways.
It totally does. They also live either forever or a really long time. We don't know, because Jesse is from the Civil War, so presumably he was born 1842 or something like that. The vampires, like I was talking about controls earlier, or governors on abilities or powers. These vampires are very well balanced, I think, and that's why Near Dark has such long legs. Why it just keeps persisting decade after decade, is because the vampires are so well balanced. You're right. The sun is probably I think the two things that can kill them, as far as we know, are sunlight, like prolonged exposure to sunlight, and they also say, May tells Caleb, if you drain me completely, I'll die. So presumably, if they have no more blood, they can die. And I think that's good. It balances them quite well. Number one, the fact that Caleb can't feed exclusively on May means that they have to forage out for human cattle, basically. Feeding on each other is too, I don't know what the word is, not insular, not solipsistic, but it's too contained, it breaks things. And I love how the version of sunlight dooms them to the day, it also allows that really good tagline. What is it? The night has its price. I love that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an amazing tagline.
It is. I wonder if they even use it as a tagline. I don't remember the posters, but it should have been a tagline if it wasn't.
It absolutely should have been. Yeah. But you mentioned you brought up Caleb and May, because Caleb, one of the big dramatic tension in the movie is Caleb likes May, wants to be around her, likes the idea of sort of being a vampire and sort of going rogue from his family. But then they all essentially tell him, like, if you really want to be a vampire, you have to kill another person.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just you can't just lick the blood off May's wrist
Mm-hmm.
forever. You have to go kill somebody. And it's his resistance to do that creates this tension with this band of absolute bloodthirsty. This is the other interesting thing about them, is they are feral sort of nomad people, but they're not animals. They have a very clear societal way of thinking, and it involves like, no, look, we can do whatever we want now. We're not the same as these other people. And it's the perfect coming of age way of looking at vampirism.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me it reminds me of Mongrels so much. Were you thinking about Mongrels? Were you thinking about this in relation to Mongrels at all?
When I was writing Mongrels, I did not have Near Dark at the front of my mind. However, when I was doing book events for the hardcover, someone asked me, what about Near Dark? This seems very, like, it seems like it owes something to Near Dark. And I was like, of course it does. But I figured out in the answer, of course I have, a great allegiance to this film. And it's definitely part of my, like, DNA kernel of being a writer. So I think it was instrumental, but it wasn't at the front of my mind. I didn't model Mongrels on Near Dark. However, I think in the postscript, or maybe I even put in the acknowledgments of the hardcover, I don't remember, I do mention Near Dark, but and I feel like I have to. If I don't mention Near Dark, then I'm lying, but I would also be lying if I said I was thinking only of Near Dark when I wrote Mongrels.
Yeah. One thing I forgot that is I knew it was part of the film. It's such a big part of the film.
Mm-hmm.
Narratively, this movie almost fakes you out. Like, it has, you and I have talked before about inevitable surprise,
Mm-hmm.
and you can very clearly see the story threads if you follow horror fiction at all.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of know where they're going with this, in the sense that he doesn't want to kill anybody, doesn't want to live this life, even though he thought he did. He had a taste of it. And you think it's going to lead to this, like, amazing showdown with these vampires.
Mm-hmm.
Then he just makes his way home, and his father, who's a veterinarian, gives him a blood transfusion, and he's cured of vampirism, and he's sort of going back to his old life, and then they come back.
Yeah.
I love that little swerve in the middle of it, because it creates such a clear distinction between the family that he was born into and the family he chooses, and how he tries to meld those two things together. And obviously he can't, because Jesse and Severin are such monstrous creatures. We talk a lot about vampires as metaphor, and that goes back forever. Mm-hmm. Where do you see the metaphor here, other than, like, I mean, they're teenage dirtbags in leather jackets, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
How does it work in your mind when you watch Near Dark?
I don't even, with Near Dark, or maybe with vampires in general, I never engage the metaphor anymore. I think the way I read the vampire is, it's like people who study, signs, symbols, metonymy. They talk about how, is it an icon or a symbol? Something, it has a stage, it has stages of evolution where it starts out referring to this, and also it can be like a metaphoric space through which you can talk about something. But at a certain point, it, like, graduates and only refers to itself, And I feel like of all of vampires, zombies, and werewolves, I think the vampire is the only one who has, like, gone on long enough or been prevalent enough in our dialogue that it has become something that refers to itself. I think zombies are definitely still a blank metaphoric space we use to talk about things, and werewolves are often either our rage or our animal inner selves or something coming to the surface. Vampires, to me, these type of vampires, anyways. Yes, a vampire that wears a cape and lives in a castle. There's a lot of class commentary going on there, but this is not that. This is, to me, something markedly different. I think I think you can read Lost Boys as a metaphor easier than you can read Near Dark in that way.
This is really interesting, because I know before you worked on Buffalo Hunter
Mm-hmm.
Hunter, you taught a vampire class
Mm-hmm.
at CU. Was this a conclusion you had developed about vampires before you taught that class, or during or after you taught that class?
During the class, towards the end of the class, we started to figure that out. There was one person in class who was really conversant in that type of stuff, and he posited that might be what's happening with the vampire. Or actually, I put it on the slideshow, and I said, "This is what's happening," and he said, "Oh, it's quit being a symbol and it refers to itself now," because he was really familiar with the dynamic or the evolution of this icon or symbol. And it was neat that we convergently came up with the same thing. He had a much better vocabulary for it. I just had an instinct for what I had seen happening. But no, when I teach a grad seminar, I never have the answers. I only go in with questions. And I'm in a room with smart people, smart, capable people who are committed to finding the answers. And generally we get somewhere. And it's really, really fun for me.
So, knowing that now and taking this back to the Buffalo Hunter Hunter, understanding, because you wrote the book after you taught that class, right? So with that conclusion emerging from that seminar, you're looking at the vampire now as something that I'm trying to do this on the fly. My brain is not as high powered as your student. If the vampire is a symbol that refers back to itself, and you're building on what 170 some odd years of vampire fiction at this point to tell your story, what is the vampire to you in the context of the Buffalo Hunter Hunter?
Wish fulfillment, basically. Of course, I've always known what the settlers, what the people coming west across America tried to do to the buffalo, and very nearly very nearly eradicated it. And so for me, it's a fantasy to throw someone out there who has the power to come at them, to give them some of what feels like justice. I'm sure other people would say it's not justice, but it feels like justice to me.
We've talked before about justice fantasies in horror, and that's something that you talked a lot about in slasher fiction. And this is obvious. I mean, it's right there in the title. It's the Buffalo Hunter Hunter. So you're obviously going back and giving some hell to a very particular kind of oppressive colonialism. What did that do for you personally, writing that book? Do you feel any better? Do you feel, is it at least satisfying in the moment, or does the satisfaction stick with you?
It's satisfying in the moment, I think. It doesn't stick because it just complicates matters. For me, anyways, it makes me confront the question, what would be justice? And it's a complicated answer. I don't have the answer. What would be justice, other than time travel or something, and we don't have that option.
Well, that's a different story. That's a whole different Earth Divers thing that you're.
Yeah.
Which I guess I can bring Earth Divers into this conversation for a minute, since we're talking about this. It is important. I'm a history nerd, and you obviously know all of this history. It is important. We all know the adage of, those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. It's important to reflect on these things. You are using fiction as a very particular portal into a very particular. And you ask the question, what is justice? And there's an element of brutality in this wish fulfillment that is countering the real historical brutality. Do you see? I mean, you just mentioned you keep referring back to this massacre, and obviously it's a huge wound that you can't ever really go back and tend to. What do you think makes you want to keep going back to it over and over again in fiction in that way?
I think I keep going back to it, and not just that atrocity, but all the atrocities, because what if the world is able to tile it over and cover it up, you know? And that's something I don't want to ever happen. I want people to remember the wrong that has been done. This is a wound that for us, for Indian people in America, has not healed. And therefore, I think the world shouldn't be allowed to pretend like it has healed.
Ooh, we got heavy with it. But you kind of have to when you dig into this stuff. Going back to your vampire class, and digging through vampire fiction, like we just talked about, Near Dark is obviously a huge touchstone for you. I know you've mentioned to me The Lesser Dead by Christopher Buehlman as a big vampire influence. What are some of your other key vampire influences that, even if they're not making their way into the Buffalo Hunter or finding their way into your fiction?
Oh man, of course, Interview with the Vampire. The first 3 books of the Vampire Chronicles have been and continue to be important for me, especially Queen of the Damned. That one, but I say especially, but I sure do love when a Lestat becomes a arena rock star. You know that what can be more fun? Than that, you know, that's the dream. But I hear that didn't the person who is show running the AMC series say that Lestat has become such a popular character that they're now going to have to make him or let him be the hair metal guy?
Yeah, the next season, the 3rd season, we will get Rockstar Lestat.
That actor, for my money, he might be the best actor working today. He is amazing.
He is, yeah.
Wow, good grief! I should have his name right here on my hand or something so I can say it better.
It's interesting you talked about the first 3 vampire. I love all the Vampire Chronicles, but I find myself going back to like 4 through 8 a bunch.
Okay. All right.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
I really like Tale of the Body Thief because it's just so weird. But I love the I think you and Anne Rice have this in common, which is I call it creative audacity, which she had, and of course it helped that she was selling books, but the fact that she was able to write something like Queen of the Damned that is so huge and so like, I'm going to do an origin story for all vampires. I think that your approach to horror fiction is to be very, it's not quite move fast and break stuff, but there is an audacity to it. And I think Mallerman also shares this, the way that you guys approach fiction. Do you see it that way as you're doing it? Is it more of just a sandbox thing for you?
Probably more of a sandbox thing. Like I really revere horror, so I would feel bad if I were just to bust into the china shop and start breaking stuff, you know. But at the same time, whenever you do art or tell a story, you have to make it peculiar. You have to make it your own, such that you can imbue it with meaning, with some import of some sort. And so yeah, I do. I mean, I am breaking stuff in the china shop, of course, but I think everyone who writes horror is doing that to some degree. And you're right about Anne Rice. Like, I think Anne Rice's special power was origin stories. Like, even like The Wolf Gift. I don't love The Wolf Gift, but I love that origin story for werewolves in that book. She had a real talent for burrowing back to what's finally a fake thing, but she makes it feel so real. And yeah, the origin of vampires is just as real for me in the chronicles, you know.
So we strayed into an Anne Rice tangent, which we could do all day. But what were you still listing vampire stories? Did I cut you off?
Oh, man, I don't remember. How about my recent favorite vampire films, maybe, which I had also, I think I'd seen all these by the time I wrote The Buffalo Hunter. The Boys from County Hell, I love that.
Oh, that's a fun movie.
So fun. I loved Renfield. It's fun in the same way. But what's that one? Blood Red Sky. I loved Blood Red Sky. Yeah, man. I love those Nosferatu on the plane. You know, that's so much fun. That's what we discovered. Not discovered. I mean, it's an obvious thing. But in Vampire Class, all vampire stories basically break down into it's a Nosferatu or it's a Dracula, and there's little flavors and variations among those. But you're either like a vampire who says, "Come into my castle," or you're a slavering beast trying to jump on anybody who walks down the trail. You know?
Well, this is the interesting thing about Near Dark. Bringing it back to Near Dark is I feel like surface level they are more Nosferatu. They are much more carnage based vampires, but Jesse in particular has that charm to him. Like you can see him cleaning up, and even Severin when he like hits on the girls, he's hitchhiking and he just slicks his hair back and acts like, you know, cool guy Bill Paxton.
Yeah.
there's such interesting hybrids, and I feel like
Yeah.
This brings me to something I wanted to ask you about the wider
Yeah.
subgenre, because I just talked to Johnny Compton
Mhm.
about his vampire book,
Mhm.
Devils Kill Devils,
Mhm.
and this past year we had that book. We had Rachel Harrison's So Thirsty. We had
Mhm.
Haley Piper's All the Hearts You Eat.
Mhm.
We've got your book coming up.
Mhm.
I know Keith Rawson is doing a vampire book
Hmm.
this year, Coffin Moon.
Oh, fun.
There was someone else that I was just thinking of that's got something vampire coming out, and I can't remember what it was. But I don't think vampires ever really go away.
Yeah.
They just sort of shapeshift for a while.
Mhm.
But it feels like right now, vampire fiction, prose fiction, is having one of its biggest moments in a while. Why do you think that is?
I think a big part of it's probably that The Walking Dead, the big zombie tentpole that has made the zombie boom or renaissance or whatever you want to call it, it's made it extend longer than it should have or than it would have without The Walking Dead. Like The Walking Dead series finally fractured into like various side series or something, and I think I'm sure those side series are good. I don't mean to talk bad about them, but I do think that when the audience splinters to go with Rick and Michonne or with Daryl and Carol or whatever they're doing, that makes it feel like less of a homogenous like movement or fan base, and that leaves some empty space that the vampire can step back into. Because you're right, the vampire never goes away. Like when the zombie is on top, the zombie is front and center in all the stories, but the zombie, when it goes into sort of remission, becomes like the background, the pressure cooker behind the front of the stage, which is where the human drama is. And zombies become the setting. That's how the zombie persists through low times. Vampires are different. They don't persist in the same like remission way that vampires do. It's more like they just like hover in the immediate shadow, and the instant the audience relaxes, the vampire pounces and they're back. And they like, you're right, they just don't go away. They refuse to go away. We're so fascinated with this idea of living forever, having to drink blood, that we tell these stories endlessly. And I mean, you can make arguments, people do make arguments that in certain political climates, either the vampire or the zombie reigns supreme. The werewolf never kind of factors into that. Werewolves are usually small stories. I think that's why. You don't see a mass of werewolves boiling up over the horizon generally. I think the most werewolves I've ever seen in a book are either Benjamin Percy's Red Moon or Michael Chabon's Summerland. Those both have a lot of werewolves. But and they're both fantastic and amazing, of course. But and we never go to mermaids or mummies. Who cares about them? We're not gonna have a centaur apocalypse or anything.
You're never gonna write a mummy novel?
I've written some mummy stories, but no, I don't think I'll write a mummy novel. I mean, mummy stories are basically shouldn't have gone into that tomb, dude. You shouldn't be a pot hunter, and I already know that, so I don't need to tell that story.
Because it's my show, and
Yeah.
and we've talked before about you're never gonna fully be done with slashers.
Mhm.
I just want to like hear it as we start to wrap up. Like ask you what slashers you've seen and read lately that you enjoyed.
Oh, Hard Eyes, of course.
Hard Eyes.
Josh Rubens. Yeah, that was all kinds of fun. Yeah. It was. I like that like hot wiring the romantic comedy with the slasher, because the romantic comedy and the slasher are the same story, the same beats. They're just opposite sides of a coin. What counts as gore in one is cute moments in the other, basically.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There was a kill in Hard Eyes, and I'm not going to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, but it involves a tire iron.
Yeah.
That I was like,
Yeah.
That's a Stephen Graham Jones
Yeah.
kill. I can't wait
Yeah.
for Stephen to see.
Yeah, that was fun. I like that one a lot.
Did you see? Oh no, I'm blanking.
Companion?
Companion.
Yeah,
That's not a slasher,
no, it's
really,
not.
but
It's kind of a slasher build, but it's not a slasher. You're right. I liked Companion a lot. Yeah.
I know you mentioned, and this might be too early to talk about, but you told me once that you were doing a vampire class, and then you were writing a vampire novel, and then you were going to work on a demonic possession class and write a demonic possession novel. I don't necessarily want to ask you to give away whatever the book is, but what we just talked about, the conclusions you drew from that vampire class. What conclusions did you draw, or are you drawing from the demon class?
What the big conclusion I drew from possession class was that the whole subgenre of possession narratives have been in a kind of fruitless arms race, trying to outrun the long shadow of The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Like when something like the slasher took like a few installments of different franchises or single shot movies to come together and figure out what it was. When Exorcist hit, and what is it, 74? Is that right? It just like it instantly crystallized the genre and allowed very very little wiggle room, and it did everything so well. And then the novel as well. The novel is just as good, I think, and that left every subsequent possession story kind of trying to have to work really hard to make room for itself. And I liked it in the last probably 4 or 5 years. We've been seeing more possession stories. Or maybe it starts with Paul's Head Full of Ghosts that are they don't come out of Judeo-Christian stuff, and but the trick is when you lose the Judeo-Christian aspect, then what I call the confirmation arc, which is basically Damien Karras running around saying, is Reagan possessed? Is she not possessed? We better prove it this way. Do these tests. I got to make this argument. All that stuff. When you don't have the church looming over everything, that confirmation arc has to express itself differently, it's fun and productive, but it also means breaking the possession story down into pieces that can be hard to puzzle back together. And so I think the genre is going to have to figure itself out all over again.
Is that a book we'll see from you soon, or are you still?
Probably not soon.
Okay.
No. I know what my next few titles are, and it's not in that mix.
Can you tell us anything about what sort of genres or subgenres you're falling into with upcoming stuff? We just talked about Killer on the Road.
Yeah, Killer on the Road is, it's built like a slasher. I would call it more of a monster story, and or highway horror too. Both of those at once. And I'll have a collection out pretty soon, and probably can't say anything past that. I have this really weird novel, which is far and away the most brutal thing I've ever written, and it's like Least of My Scars has always been the darkest novel of mine, but this novel makes that look like a kid eating a lollipop or something. It goes really dark, and it was uncomfortable to write, and it's a weirdly put together novel, and I expect my editor is going to hate it. It's a really hateable novel, and it may get me canceled too.
Is this your Jack Ketchum book?
My Girl Next Door?
Yeah.
No, I would never say I can out-dark Jack Ketchum.
Yeah.
But I do, when I sent him Least of My Scars to blurb, I forget what his blurb exactly was, but it was something like, this novel is brutal. Or he said something, it was the biggest compliment I could possibly get from someone like Jack Ketchum. I was so proud of that.
Rest in peace, Jack Ketchum.
Yeah.
Our guest has been Stephen Graham Jones. The Buffalo Hunter is in bookstores March 18th. Stephen, before we let you go, can you let everybody know where to find you online?
The only place I hang out is Blue Sky. You can just search my name. You'll find my website too, stephengrahamjones.com. And yeah, just Blue Sky for me.
All right. Stephen, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for being on the show.
It was great, man. Thanks.
Thanks once again to Stephen Graham Jones for being on the show. It's always fun to talk to Stephen. It was great to be able to chat with him in person this time. We had a lot of fun. Hope you guys enjoyed it. He will be doing a lot of book tour stuff over the next few weeks, including some virtual events that you can tune in for. So if you're a fan of Stephen's work, go over to his website, which he just mentioned at the end of the interview. Follow him on social media. Keep up with everything he's got going on. It's going to be fun. And if you want to keep up with everything that we have going on, we are on social media. We are mostly on Blue Sky right now. We are at scareshapedus.bsky.social. We're also Scares Shaped Us on Twitter. We're the Scares That Shaped Us on Facebook. We're the Scares That Shaped Us on YouTube, if that's how you prefer to listen to your podcasts. We also have a website, thescaresthatshapedus.com. That's where you can find an archive of episodes and ways to contact us, how to find us on social media. You can also just email me at scaresthatshapeduspodcast@gmail.com. If you have a question, a suggestion, you want to put a book on my radar, you want to complain at me about something, I don't care. I'll read your emails. I love hearing from everybody. That does it for me this week. We will be back next week with another brand new episode and another great horror writer. Erica T. Worth will be on the show next week to talk about her new novel, The Haunting of Room 904, which is excellent. And it's also our first time going back over a story, which it was really fun. Erica picked Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and we covered that in our Halloween special last year, but I wanted Erica's take on it, and she did not disappoint. It's a fun episode, a fun chat that will drop March 19th at noon Central. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. I'm Matthew Jackson, and this is The Scares That Shaped Me.